Hello, I'm Michael Collins at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you all to the fifth event in our 2025 Zoom season, Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we bring together scholars and their audiences to explore themes of encounter in literary works and in contemporary cultural debates. Today, Professor Michael Scott will be talking about The Merchant of Venice. Michael Scott has a long and distinguished career in higher education. He was head of the School of Arts and Humanities and then pro-vice chancellor at De Montfort University in Leicester. He was the founding vice chancellor of Wrexham Glyndŵr University. He's written 6 books on Shakespeare and Renaissance drama and has edited or co-edited at least 4 others. He has written 2 novels, Hamlet and the Psychotherapist, and The Scottish King, Macbeth and the Psychotherapist. He has been a teacher of Shakespeare and theater throughout his career. Like Chaucer's clerk, gladly would he teach, and I know from experience with him in the classroom, he does a great job at it. Michael Scott is now senior advisor to the president of Georgetown University and director of the Future of the Humanities Project at Georgetown, as well as senior dean and fellow of Blackfriars Hall, an associate member of the English faculty, University of Oxford. Michael will begin in a moment, but just let me remind you, if you have any questions during the talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button on your computer. Towards the end, I will ask as many questions as possible for Michael Scott to answer. Please don't leave your questions for the last minute, as we may, as we often do, run out of time. And so now, without any further introduction, I present Michael Scott.
Hello. The opening lines of most of Shakespeare's plays tend to indicate the general story, themes, and tone of the play to come. For example, in Antony and Cleopatra, we have the opening, "Nay, but this dotage of our generals o'erflows the measure." Or in Twelfth Night, "If music be the food of love, play on." Or in Richard II, "Old John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster, hast thou, according to thy oath and band, brought hither Henry Hereford, thy bold son." So it's often useful to begin a discussion of his plays with the opening words. In The Merchant of Venice, the merchant Antonio is saying to his friends, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me. You say it wearies you, but how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn. And such a want-wit sadness makes of me, that I have much ado to know myself." The play that follows shows that Antonio does have much to learn, but in that, does it resolve his sadness? Does it allow him to know himself or to confess what he knows about himself? In this talk, I want to consider The Merchant of Venice from the perspective of cultural encounters that it reveals, some of which are resolved and some are not. In the context of Pope Francis's encouragement of cultural encounters as a means of finding and respecting the otherness in others, we might today, in that respect, find it a rather negative play. The Merchant of Venice was written around 450 years ago, but we are approaching the Shakespearean culture from the context of our own culture. Although we teach Shakespeare in schools and universities, and although his plays still attract large audiences, we have centuries of discovery and change embedded in our response to his plays. I just mentioned our current Pope, but in Shakespeare's day, a Pope was a man you'd not cite, not in England, except in derogatory terms. And I sometimes say to my students, did you know that Shakespeare probably never ate a potato? Although Falstaff does refer to potatoes in The Merry Wives of Windsor. It's a time gap, an enormous time gap, and just the ordinary things that we're familiar with now were not the things that he was familiar with. So somehow we have to reconcile our contemporary being with that of Shakespeare's age and with his style of work. He tends from the start to know his endings, but he doesn't necessarily get there in a straight narrative line. As the 18th century dramatist Congreve was to note, plays are more than their endings. With the linearity of The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare creates interactive, almost self-contained narratives with the intention of link-ups or contrasts to the main narrative that is encountering it. The problem with the play is that one of those interactive narratives appears to become more prominent in itself than the linear narrative that supports it. Whenever the play is performed, people ask, who's playing Shylock? At times, through the centuries, the final scene of the play has been even dropped altogether. It therefore ends at the end of Act 4 in many adaptations. So it ends with the punishment of the Jew. For example, the American actor Edwin Booth did this in 1864, first in San Francisco and then at the Haymarket Theatre in London. He finished it. End of Act 4, that's the end of the play. There's another act. It's forgotten. Furthermore, during the progress of the play, Antonio's original sadness is exacerbated to such a degree that it nearly leads to his death. Also, at the end of Act 4, that is where he's reprieved from his death, leaving Act 5 to be some kind of coda wherein he has little prominence. Today we encounter these issues with the play with the knowledge of its performance history over the centuries, its reputation, and the debates surrounding its moral positioning in a way that was not certainly applicable when it was first written. I don't think that anywhere in the play Shakespeare is anti-Semitic. Indeed, Shakespeare would not have recognized the terminology, but he does create Christian characters which we would term to be anti-Semitic today. To relate his fiction to him as a person, to say that because he creates anti-Semitic characters, he himself was anti-Semitic, is as ridiculous as saying that in the 20th century, the playwright Edward Bond is a violent man because he wrote about the violence of his society, just as Bond himself said that Jane Austen wrote about manners in her society. With the understanding of our difference as an audience from that of Shakespeare's time, or indeed the audience of any of the following centuries of the play, we can return to look afresh at The Merchant of Venice, to question whether the cultural encounters in the play bring people together or leave them stranded, and whether we can see that now, 450 odd years later. The principal encounters to consider are between Antonio and Bassanio, Jew and Christian, female and male values, those three areas. And I would discuss each of them in turn and bring them together in what might be considered two independent conclusions to the play, one in Act 4 and one in Act 5. So let's start with Antonio and Bassanio. As much as his friends Salarino, Lorenzo, and Graziano tried to cheer Antonio up in Act 1, he continues, I hold the world, but as the world, Graziano, a stage where every man must play a part, and mine a sad one. When Solano suggests that he might be in love, Antonio immediately responds irritably with fie. It is as if he cannot conceive of such an issue. Or perhaps he's just defensive about its possibility because of his nature. As soon as all the others except Bassanio have left, Antonio then opens up to his friend Bassanio when they're alone and everybody else has gone. Bassanio, he says, tell me now, what lady is the same to whom you swore a recent pilgrimage that you today promised to tell me of? It appears that now that he's alone with Bassanio, he has got straight to the point, straight to the thing that was on his mind. Is Shakespeare implying that the merchant's sadness is to do with Bassanio and a woman? Bassanio prevaricates so as to prepare the ground for an eventual request for more money from the merchant. He talks about, when I shot an arrow as a boy, I'd shoot another arrow to find where the first arrow had gone, and so on. He prevaricates. But then eventually he gets to the point, and he says, in Belmont is a lady richly left, and she is fair, and fairer than that word of wondrous virtues. We might ask whether her riches are the chief of her wondrous virtues. Bassanio is asking for money to create the means to repay the money already loaned to him by Antonio and which he has squandered. If he can marry a wealthy woman, who incidentally is also beautiful, he can use her money to repay his debt and to enjoy his life. The depth of Antonio's love for his friend is that although the adventure will result in the merchant losing Bassanio for a wife, he is immediately prepared to do it, to lend him the money. However, all his wealth is at sea, so he'll need to borrow money from the market to do so. This, as he later tells the moneylender, is something which he never does. Albeit, I neither lend nor borrow, by taking nor by giving excess, yet to supply the ripe wants of my friend, I'll break custom. Neither a lender nor a borrower be, Polonius says to Laertes in Hamlet. And of course, Shakespeare knew that in lending and borrowing, his own father had got into big financial problems in his own life. Now, this is something where we can see a connection between Shakespeare, the author, and the play that he's writing, just slightly. It's to do with issues that Shakespeare has experienced, though not in terms of the anti-Semitic ones. The whole episode points towards Antonio's intense love for his friend. It's exacerbated by what ensues when the moneylender, no friend of Antonio's, suggests that in a merry sport, the forfeit against the sum loaned should be a pound of Antonio's flesh. The merchant readily agrees, but Bassanio is horrified and protests that he doesn't like the idea. Antonio, however, is adamant, saying that his argosies, where his wealth lies, in them coming back to Venice, will bring him the means of repayment before the 3 months forfeit might be imposed. The relationship between Antonio and Bassanio is based on one man's love for his male friend, albeit that love is largely hidden. It cannot be spoken. Homosexuality was a capital offence in Elizabethan England. Capital offence. However, there is no indication that Bassanio, on the other hand, is homosexual, although there is a suggestion that Antonio might be in the love that he has for Bassanio. The important issue here is also that the money lender is the Jew, Shylock, which leads to the second encounter to be considered, that between Christian and Jew. Let us look first at the relationship between English Christians and Jews at the time that Shakespeare was writing. There were not many Jews living in England at the time that this play was written in around 1595-96. The late and much missed 20th century critic Julia Briggs estimated the number to be no more than 200. In the year 1190, all the Jews in York, the city of York, had been rounded up, imprisoned in Clifford's Tower, and burned to death. All of them. In 1290, Edward I had expelled all the Jews from England. The few Jews that did live in London in the late 16th century would have been mainly conversos, that is, Jews from Spain or Portugal who had been forced by their native authorities to convert to Christianity. Such enforced conversions were not uncommon. People were often forced to belong to a religious sect, the religious sect that the various monarchs of the various countries had decided to have for that country, Catholic or Protestant or what kind of Protestantism. Not to be of the correct sect was not merely regarded as heresy, but as possible treachery, as was well known in Shakespeare's England, with the clamp down on the Protestants under Mary Tudor, and then of the Catholics under Elizabeth. The converso Jews who lived in England were mainly in the professions, would be people such as doctors. And one of them was Rodriguez Lopez, the physician to the Queen, who in 1594 was condemned to death for allegedly plotting to poison her. It was probably a trumped-up charge made by the Earl of Essex to gain more credibility with the Queen and at court. But Lopez was horrifically hung, drawn, and quartered with two fellow conspirators, a man and a woman, on the 7th of June, 1594. And he was done so in public. The Queen later returned the confiscated estate of Lopez to his widow and granted her and her son a stipend as a form of compensation for what had happened, and that the son could go to Winchester School. At the execution itself, Lopez claimed to love the Queen and Jesus Christ. The crowd, laughing, apparently shouted out that he was a Jew. Maybe this stirred up a certain anti-Semitism in the city for a while. It could also have given Shakespeare the idea for his famous speech in a rather gruesome way, because being hung, drawn, and quartered, you would see the public, and there was a vast number of people came to see this, this execution, and they came as an entertainment. And the people who had houses around would sell them drinks as they were watching and food as they were watching, like a football match now. So, in the most famous speech, one of the most famous speeches in the play, Shylock actually points out his humanity. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer, as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why revenge? The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. There's this attitude, I am human. You are Christian, I'm Jew, but I'm still human, he is saying. And yet, if you show violence towards me, I will show violence towards you. However, there were other encounters with Jews. A few years earlier, in 1590, Christopher Marlowe had written an outrageous play about a Jew of Malta in which the Jew of Barabbas had been depicted as a Machiavellian plotter, adept at using poison to kill whoever was in his way. At one point, this included a convent of nuns. In the end, Marlowe's Jew dies in a cauldron he prepared for someone else. Maybe this demonstrated to Shakespeare that there was an audience for a play which included a Jew, although not one that was as grimly treated as Lopez at his execution, or as sensational in death as the fictional Barabbas in Boiling Oil. Shakespeare's Jew was Venetian. At that time, Venetia was different from England in its tolerance of a variety of Christian persuasions. It welcomed strangers of differing denominations, including Protestant aristocrats fleeing England during the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary Tudor, who reigned from 1553 to 1558. But the Venetian attitudes to Jews was different from their attitude towards Christians. From March 1516, the Jews in Venice were forced to live in the ghetto, which was an enclosure separated from the rest of the population, and in which there were no windows that faced out towards the city. The windows only faced inwards, so in a kind of a square, so that they faced in to each other. The Jews were allowed out of the ghetto only during daylight hours. One of the problems for the Jews did originate, in St. Matthew's Gospel, which recorded that when Pilate appeared to be reluctant about executing Jesus Christ, the Jews who had brought the accusations against him cried out that the Nazarenes' blood should be on them and on their children. A curse for Jews throughout the ages in a Christian environment. Whether of Catholic or Protestant persuasion, the Jews were seen as different, as outsiders, or others whose otherness was to be avoided or eliminated in one way or another. And this included forced conversion. With the Jewish moneylender Shylock, however, Shakespeare creates a character who dislikes the Christians as much as they dislike the Jews. In an aside to the audience, Shylock says of Antonio, I hate him, for he is a Christian, but more for that in low simplicity he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of usance here with us in Venice. If I can catch him once upon the hip, I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him. Furthermore, he complains that Antonio hates our sacred nation, and he rails even there when merchants most do congregate on me, my bargains, and my well-won thrift, which he calls interest. Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him. The Jew calls thrift, the Christian calls interest, as if interest is a dirty word. And yet two words, two different words for the same thing. Such an aside may show the character of the moneylender as a kind of a vice figure, an evil figure, confiding evil with the audience, his evil with the audience. But it also throws further light on the merchant. Shylock records that Antonio has been verbally abusing him, calling him a misbeliever and a cutthroat dog. Also that Antonio has spat on his Jewish gabardine, regarding him as no more than a dog. To which Antonio replies, I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. If anyone is anti-Semitic, as we term it today, it is Antonio. But in this cultural encounter, neither side is prepared to respect the otherness in the other, but rather score points off each other. The Jew, for example, tells the Old Testament story of Laban and Jacob, both tricking each other over lambs, but Jacob gaining victory in the end. Antonio shows his knowledge of the tale by quickly pointing out that a solution was swayed and fashioned by the hand of heaven. So, Shylock says the argument, tells about the argument, it's part of his heritage, but Antonio shows that he knows the answer. He knows the Bible as well as Shylock, by saying he knows the solution was swayed and fashioned by the hand of heaven. That's the way in which the Bible ends the story. He knows his Bible as well as Shylock. He then, perhaps self-satisfies, draws an affinity between the Jew and Satan. In an aside, and now it's his aside, he says, the devil can cite scripture for his purpose. An evil soul producing holy witness is like a villain with a smiling cheek, a goodly apple rotten at the heart. Oh, what goodly outside falsehood hath. Oh, what goodly outside falsehood hath. Yet they're both doing the same thing, both in asides, both. Now he's calling him a devil. Before, you've got Shylock saying how much he hates him. You're getting this. They can't get a movement together. The encounter is too great. There is no respect for the other in their otherness as far as Antonio is concerned about Shylock. Yet maybe in Antonio's self-satisfaction, Shakespeare is showing that Antonio is blind to the message that just as in the Bible, tricks were played by both Laban and Jacob on each other and were resolved by God, so a trick might soon be played on Antonio. But he can't see that. He can't see that hint that's coming through because he is determined. He's determined on his despite and dislike of the Jews. He's blind in his prejudice. It is in the merry bond that Shylock proposes to Antonio that we find this complexity of different understandings and differing cultures. 1 pound of flesh taken from Antonio would be fatal, but Antonio will risk that for his friend. He's a Christian. As St. John's Gospel states, greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friend. For the Jew, all that matters is that he will have revenge on the Christian Antonio for his antipathy towards his race, to the way in which Jews are abused. He will do this according to his culture, through a bond, through, that is, the law, since the law in the Jewish tradition defines much of their religion and their culture. The culture of encounter is thereby, on one side defined by assurances in the merchant's Christian self, the Christian side. He believes in himself. He believes he is right. And on the other, by the Jews' certainty in the strict adherence to tradition in the law. This is what the law states, and we go by what the law states. Two opposing intellectual conflicts. You can't help, I think, but realize that though this is written 450 years ago, it could be written now in the context of the application it has to modern events that are going on in rather difficult circumstances and wars in the world. Shakespeare then adds two further stories within the linear narrative of the drama, which play off the Christian-Jew encounter that has started to dominate the play. The first is the introduction of the clown Lancelot Jobby, sometimes known as Lancelot Gobbo. It depends on which editor your copy of the play has been responsible for. Lancelot Jobby is a servant to the Jew. He comically debates whether he should leave his master Shylock or remain true to him. It is a comic episode concerning conscience, but it is immediately followed by the arrival of his own blind father, on whom he plays a trick similar to the one played by Jacob in the Old Testament on his blind father, Isaac. It is a multifaceted story of Isaac, his brother-in-law Laban, and his sons Jacob and Esau that are referenced through the two scenes. Jacob plays on his father's blindness in the Bible by pretending to be as hairy as his elder brother Esau, and thereby gains his father's blessing and inheritance rather than Esau gaining it. He gets in there first, pretends that he is Esau, and Esau being hairy, Jacob actually puts on a goat skin to make him feel hairy, and therefore he gets the blessing and the inheritance. Lancelot Jobby similarly plays on his father's blindness, telling him at first that his son is dead, and then contradicting himself. The old man feels then the boy's face in order to prove that he is alive and not dead, but he plays the other trick. He turns his head round, and what the old man feels is the back of his head, which is too hairy. It's a throwback to the Isaac story and the two boys. Lancelot has simply turned the tables on his father, and then he admits he's his son and what he's been doing. It's a comic episode, but it allows a continuity from the Bible stories being used in the former scene of one-upmanship between Jew and Christian. If always got to be one, there's got to be better than the other. With all of this, however, there is a certain cruel humour which soon is followed by Shylock's daughter, the Jewish Jessica, eloping with the Christian Lorenzo and going to Belmont, the beautiful place where she becomes a Christian. And that story, the story of the elopement, is an old story, and Barbara Mujica talked about it when she was discussing Don Quixote last week, a similar story within that novel, written only about 12 years after the Merchant of Venice. Shakespeare at this point is only just about hanging on, I think, to the play, in mixing comedy with tragedy. Where do we go with this play when you've got these comic scenes going on such issues in which people are being persecuted or are going to be persecuted? In 1870, when Sir Henry Irving played Shylock, he introduced a scene after the elopement of Jessica, whereby Shylock slowly walked across the bridge and went to his home. He knocked on the door 3 times before realizing that Jessica had gone. Nothing was said as the interval curtain fell. Irving, in doing this, made Shylock into a tragic figure, gaining more sympathy for him from the audience. In 1971, Emrys James, as Shylock in an RSC production directed by Terry Hands, similarly came back to an empty house and was seen searching the rooms for his daughter as the house lights went up for the interval. These early scenes in the play are such that they set up a catastrophe, which we find in Act 4. In both these examples, a tragic character for the Jew is being emphasized these days in performance. What is implied is not indicated with such definition in the text. That is for the actors to do. In the early 18th century, the actors at Covent Garden and Lincoln's Inn Field, the actors played Falstaff as a comic figure, from like Pantalone in the Commedia dell'arte. He was a comic character to be laughed at. Gradually through the years, gradually through these centuries, the actors have gone back to the text and even added to the text to make him a more tragic character. Whilst all this is going on, Shakespeare has to show, and does show, what has been happening in Belmont, where Bassanio has gone. So let me turn to Belmont. Before then, I'll come to the double conclusion of the play. The scenes in Belmont push the narrative into a fairy story mode in which the encounters of difference nevertheless continue to proliferate. In this case, difference between men and women. The trial of the gold, silver, and lead caskets that Portia's dead father has set for any man wishing to marry her is veiled firstly by a man of colour from Morocco. He is seen off with a rather racist comment, what we'd call racist comment, from Portia. Let all of his complexion choose me so. The silver one is selected by Aragon, the Spaniard, whose name and region in Spain, Aragon, would no doubt have reminded Shakespeare's audience of the divorce and humiliation of Queen Catherine of Aragon, cruelly pushed aside by Henry VIII in his desire for a new wife. Nevertheless, the female, Portia, gets her way despite her father. The gold seeker, and that's what he is, Bassanio, with perhaps a little help from the women and the music that sounds, chooses the leaden casket, and so wins the lady who has chosen him. News soon comes that Antonio has failed to meet the deadline for the repayment of Shylock. the repayment to Shylock, who is demanding his bond in full. Bassanio leaves for the trial, although all think it is too late. But the female Portia has other plans. In a patriarchal society, the encounter between women and men is laid down by the latter. Women are not allowed to be in the professions. So Portia and her maid Nerissa have to disguise themselves as men to go to the court to plead the case of Antonio. Portia takes the role of Bellario, a young learned lawyer, and delivers one of the most famous speeches in the whole of Shakespeare, as she pleads to Shylock to be merciful and relinquish his bond. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis the mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His sceptre shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein both do sit, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the heart of kings. It is an attribute to God himself. I remember back in the 1970s, a Hungarian refugee from the Soviet invasion in 1956, who was an actor and opera singer named Andrei Muller. He had his cast put up umbrellas to ridicule this plea that comes from her. And I think people didn't like it and criticized Muller for doing it because it's a wonderful poetic address. But the fact is, it's not a Venetian address, nor is it an address to the Jew. It has nothing to do with Venice, and it has nothing to do with the Jew. It is an English address, making sense to Shakespeare's English audience. So it's Shakespeare coming out of the play with something to talk about mercy, which the English audience would link with. But it's not factually relevant. Venice was a republic, not a monarchy. So the references to monarchs and gods are there for that English audience. It can't be there for anything else, because the Venetians wouldn't accept what is being said. And similarly, for a strict Jew who insists on the law, it is foreign. It's almost an unintelligible concept. And it is here that we have another cultural encounter between the audience and the setting of the play, which Shakespeare manipulates. Shylock loses his bond on a matter of law, which references Christianity. In the context of the Reformation, and earlier indeed, the Catholic central liturgy was the sacrifice of the Mass, when Catholic theologians insisted not only to imitate the death and resurrection of Christ in that liturgy, but they actually brought Christ back in the consecrated bread, raised high for the congregation to see. They saw that as the body of Christ. The same occurred with the consecrated wine, raised up as the blood of Christ. The bread, however, was the thing that was to be shared with the congregation. And when the complaints came, well, why not the wine to be shared with the congregation? It was said, well, the body of Christ and the bread as the body of Christ contains the blood. You can't have the body without the blood. And if you do, you kill people. You can't have flesh without blood. And indeed, there had been a medieval play called The Play of the Sacrament, in which a Jew had bought actually a host from a merchant and taken the host, and he and his friends had cut it in two. And what happened? Blood fell out. Shylock would not have expected, like these Jewish thieves in the sacrament, Play of the Sacrament, did not expect, could expect these sacramental issues relating to the body of Christ as found in the liturgy of the Mass. So the pound of Antonio's flesh could not be taken without the spilling of blood, which would then be seen as illegal if his aim was to kill Antonio. In one sense, Shylock, however, is being defeated by a matter of Christian theological debate. Antonio continues to be seen as a spiteful man and demands that as part of Shylock's punishment, he should become a Christian. He's going to be forced as a converso. It is the cruelty of this sentence which is highlighted in Michael Radford's 2004 film of the play, when the defeated Shylock, portrayed by Al Pacino, is seen at the doors of the synagogue as his brethren enter wearing their Jewish clothes. He can't wear such clothes anymore, and he's left there outside, isolated from his faith and community. Yet for Shakespeare, that is not the end of the encounter. What of Antonio? The final Act 5 is a coda to the rest. It begins with Jessica and Lorenzo on a beautiful night, recalling lovers of the past, all of whom, however, had checkered histories. Portia and Nerissa, earlier in the play, had given their husbands rings. These rings were symbols of their fidelity, and the women made them promise never to give them away. However, at the end of the trial scene, at Antonio's prompting, they gave them to the lawyers, that is, to the women in disguise. On returning to Belmont, Portia and Nerissa ask to see their rings, but the men cannot produce them. They tell them the story of parting with them for a just cause, and Antonio again tries to help the man he loves. I once did lend my body for his wealth, which but for him, that had your husband's ring, had quite miscarried. I dare be bound again, my soul upon the forfeit, that your Lord will never more breathe fault advisedly. Portia accepts his surety. She shows a forgiveness which was absent in both men, the Jew and the Shylock, the Jew Shylock and the Christian Antonio, through the course of the play. The husbands agree to be faithful to the women, and so their encounter ends well. 3 of Antonio's Argosies have been reported not to have floundered, which gives Antonio some joy. But as the married couples go off happily, he is alone, just as Shylock, the Jew, at the end of Act 4, has been left alone. If only they had forgiven each other, rather than one trying to triumph over the other, the encounter would have ended differently. But maybe it wouldn't have made such an interesting play. It is a type of cultural encounter which continues to this day, where no one wins and some fall. Antonio is left as he was at the beginning. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. Some might say, oh yes, we do. You love Bassanio. Thank you for listening.
So thank you very much, Michael. Beautiful talk and a lovely ending. Let me see if we have some questions in the Q&A. No. So I will. I want to ask you a question. You know, there's something that has always puzzled me in some way, or at least kind of made me stop and pause when I read the very ending of the play. When Portia gives Jessica and Lorenzo the deed of gift that Shylock has implemented at her behest in Venice, money that now money will go to Lorenzo and Jessica, some of Shylock's money. That's part of the deal that Shylock has to strike. Lorenzo, the Christian, says, "Lady, you drop bread." I think that's the way, it's something like that. And I didn't want to get up and grab the text, but he says something like, you drop bread on starved people. That's allusion to the old the Hebrew Bible, where the Jews are in the desert starving to
Yeah.
death, and they find manna,
Manna.
which is also a symbol or a foreshadowing, the bread, a foreshadowing of the Eucharist. And I've asked one of my questions to anybody who talks about the Merchant of Venice is, what do you make of that? Do you see any connection? Both in the fact that it ties into the bread, but it also and the Eucharist, but it also the Christian draws his metaphor from the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, but Christ was a Jew, and that's also forgotten. And you see, in that earlier exchange, Antonio knew the ending to the Laban problem. So in Christianity, the Hebrew Bible prefigures what is to come. And so there's a prefiguration there being said on the Christian side, and the whole of Act 5 is about the Christian side. It's not about the Jewish side. That's over. That's done. He's got his punishment. This comes about what is true, what is good within the Christian element. That's how I would see it. But yes, it's the manna, but the manna that Christ brings is the bread of life, which is his own body in his own sacrifice.
I always think that, and somehow that it also says these people are not quite as different as they think they are. They're drawing both from the same tradition, and that is interesting. That, as I said, I always find that the Christian uses the Hebrew metaphor for at that moment. Hang on now, there's a question here from Joe Simmons. Thanks for a thoughtful talk. I take your point that the court speech on mercy is directed primarily to the English audience, but it seems like the Jewish character, Shylock, would certainly hear echoes from the Hebrew Bible, asking God's mercy and compassion, the command to forgive debts in the Jubilee, and so on. He says, just my 2 cents. And Joe's 2 cents are only worth several dollars, I think.
I think that just is left up to the audience, and it, in a sense, it's the way that the play is received, or the way it plays is performed by actors and received by audiences, different audiences, and an audience which was really au fait with the Hebrew Bible would agree with, as Joe is, would agree with what Joe is saying. Yeah, no problem. Good to hear from you, Joe. Hope you're doing well.
Yeah. The other thing of God, there might be a second question in here. Also, no, I'm sorry. Joe again. Your talk also reminds me of another great treatment of The Merchant of Venice that you arranged in the Christian Shakespeare series about 5 years ago, with Archbishop Rowan Williams. Just a week or so before we locked down for the COVID. We have experienced much since then. Thanks for bringing this back to our attention. Yes, and it's Rowan Williams who also points out the Eucharistic dimension, the sacramental dimension of the Merchant of Venice. I remember that talk very well.
Yeah. And indeed of the bond, the nature of the bond.
Yes. Yeah. Also, I wondered about the ring. I always think it's worth noting that in that scene, Act 3, Scene 1, where Shylock gives the great speech, when he discovers that Jessica has traded a ring for a monkey. He says, I had it of Leah as a bachelor. We assume that's his wife. I had it of Leah as a bachelor. He says, I wouldn't have traded it for a wilderness of monkeys. And so
Yeah.
at that point he has the effect, the ring has only sentimental value. And for the two Christians who give their rings away to the doctor and the doctor's clerk, the rings seem only to be to have, as to use a current word, transactional value. You know, one thing for another thing.
Yes, and the Christian audience, knowing, and those that knew the Hebrew Bible, would know that Leah was, I'm just trying to get it right in my head, was either the wife or the sister, I think it was the wife
Yeah.
of Isaac. So it goes back to that story.
Story, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But happens to be his wife as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's what's, it is, we think, an early play, and yet it has such complexity to it and such integration of disparate parts, which are all kind of talking back to one another, but in ways we can't quite put our finger on. But,
I think he's still right, trying to get his formula right. You know that he gets the formula in Comedy of Errors in 1593. Then you get A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is tending to start to experiment with that formula. Then suddenly you get the Merchant of Venice, which is a different formula than his comedies. Then you're going to go back to Twelfth Night and to As You Like It, which gets the formula perfect, particularly in 12th Night. So he's got a problem there within his structure, or in his experimenting of the structure. The other thing is that I noticed there's this period between the end of 1593 through 1594 and 1595, where there is plague and the theatres are closed, which give him an opportunity to write a lot of plays, and you get suddenly kind of a glut of plays coming out at the end of 1595 and into 1596. One of which is Richard II, in which John of Gaunt talks about stubborn jury. Stubborn jury talks about the sepulchre stubborn jury, and that stubborn jury, might have been on his mind because he's writing The Merchant of Venice almost at the same time that he's writing Richard II, during this period when people are dying everywhere around him. So yeah, it's interesting. The other interesting thing is that that's when, in 1594, of course, is when Lopez is executed, when the theatres are closed, but he's still executed in public, and the public can go and watch the execution. And people actually sold drinks and food to the people who were watching. Masses went in.
I think it's Stephen Greenblatt who, in his wildly imaginative biography, wonders whether Shakespeare didn't witness the execution of Lopez, and that was the impetus for the great speech in The Merchant of Venice.
Well, that's what I think, you see. I think that might be the case. However, I'm not sure that he would have been in London.
Yeah.
Because of the plague. I think he'd have been in Stratford. Sure. But he would have known about what happened, and maybe that's what that did cause the impetus. And also, if he was being punished for poisoning the Queen, he probably would have had his eyes taken out, and hath not the Jew eyes. You could read it, actually, if you could read it in a different way. You could read it in Shakespeare in being part of the enjoyment of the comedy of a man's fate, but I don't think that ties in with the rest of the play. I don't think so. I don't think he does that. I think there's a humanity there.
Yeah. I think I agree. Well, we're about out of time, Michael, so we kind of have to stop there, but thank you very much. It was as I said, a very lovely talk. Give me a minute before we sign off. The next Cultural Encounter talk will be on Monday, the 31st, a week from today, at 11 a.m. Eastern Time and 4 p.m. UK time. The clocks have changed at that point.
The clocks will have changed. Yes, they will.
So 4 p.m. in the UK, 11 a.m. in the United States. And it'll be a talk on The Great Gatsby by Maureen Corrigan of Georgetown University. On Wednesday, the 9th of April, 4 p.m. UK time, 11 a.m. US time, there's a free speech session, a debate on this question: can Western democracies preserve an independent judiciary? A question that's very much on the minds of people in the United States these days. So thanks to Georgetown University for supporting this series, especially to the Vice President for Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks also to the administrator at the Office of Global Affairs at Georgetown, Mary Gordon, who does the administrative work. Also, we'd like to thank Blackfriars Hall for their support, especially John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and their administrator, John Angus Macaulay. I'm Michael Collins from Georgetown University. Thanks again to Michael Scott for a great talk, and thank you all for joining us. Take care, and we hope to see you next week.